Welcome to the Chapter Breakdown, a program where we have in-depth conversations about literary fiction, nonfiction, and philosophy. My name is Connor, and this is my brother Parker.
Hi.
For our inaugural episode, we shall discuss Hannah Arendt's harrowing coverage of the trial of Nazi officer Adolf Eichmann, published in 1963 as Eichmann in Jerusalem. Hannah Arendt is a 20th century philosopher who began her career immersed in early 20th century German existentialism, studying under first Martin Heidegger, with whom she had a clandestine relationship, then briefly under Edmund Husserl, and subsequently under Karl Jaspers. This intellectual background helped to develop Arendt's heady, discursive style. However, Arendt, who was Jewish, was forced to flee Germany in 1933 due to the rise of the Nazi Party. Arendt's troubled life as a refugee, the betrayal of her former teacher Heidegger and his support for the Nazi Party, and, most importantly, and most devastatingly, the historic and unthinkable tragedy of the European Jews during World War II, all had a lasting influence on Arendt's viewpoints and philosophical interests. In the 1950s, Arendt engaged in her most influential work, using a characteristic blend of existential subjectivity and social systems analysis to understand how societies structure and compose human activity, and how the tenuousness of subjective freedom in those societies can degrade violently into totalitarian desubjectivization. In the early 1960s, Israel captured the Nazi fugitive Adolf Eichmann, a logistical officer of the Reich Main Security Office, an instrument of Heinrich Himmler's notorious SS paramilitary organization. Eichmann, one of the highest-ranking officers responsible for the Holocaust, to have both survived the war and escaped the trials at Nuremberg, proved an important case study for Arendt's theories. So she traveled to Jerusalem to cover the trial. The resulting book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, proved an enduring but controversial investigation into the bureaucracy of genocide, most famous for coining the term the banality of evil, which refers to Eichmann's personification of the terrifying juxtaposition between the tediously mundane and the unspeakably evil. I think in discussing this book, Parker, a good place to start is by unpacking this famous phrase, known by many who have not read the book, within its context in the work. As it turns out, this phrase, the banality of evil, proves to be the very last line of the book, a kind of poetic recapitulation of Arendt's judgment on Eichmann and what he represents. Were you surprised to discover that the banality of evil proved to be like a summary term, rather than as language that is deployed in one of the central conceptual arguments of the book?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to start because that is definitely the most famous headline from the book, the thing I had heard about before I'd read it, and it just doesn't really come up at all. I kind of kept waiting for it to happen and waiting for it to happen, and it just gets thrown in there at the end. And it's not wrong exactly. The book is kind of about that, but I don't know. I've seen some criticism of that exact phrase, and I don't even really get the sense that Arendt would care so much about defending that or pushing that exact formulation very strongly at all. Definitely a eye-opening thing for me.
I mean, to me, when you go into this book, there sort of looms over you the shadow of this phrase, right? Like, you expect the banality of evil to arise somehow. And it is there in the themes that are developed throughout the book. The portrait you get of Eichmann is of somebody who's very disappointing in the sense of looking for someone responsible for such a horrendous crime. And a lot of what the book tries to do is unpack how exactly someone who seems so quote-unquote normal can be responsible for something so horrific and caused so much misery. And part of how Arendt argues that occurs is she relates this banal personality of Eichmann not as something incidental to the actions that he undertakes, but rather as fundamentally ingrained into how such a horrendous crime occurs throughout a whole society. The question that always arises when you look at the Holocaust is, how could a whole nation of people come together and do something so ridiculously monstrous? And the machinery of that is that people who are totally mundane and uninteresting and have no necessary proclivity to shocking acts of violence can participate in evil within the structures by which it becomes normal. It becomes banal. It's not necessarily that Eichmann, because he's this horrendous person, is capable of committing evil, but rather that evil, in order to happen at scale, requires a certain element of it to be banal, such that people like Eichmann can handle the logistics of genocide, and the people who maybe are capable of extraordinary acts of violence can do it in the field.
Yeah, and reading the book, you're sort of waiting for insight where he either realizes how horrible the things he was doing or tries to defend them. But it's a lot more like in Office Space when they're describing how they're stealing like 1/10 of a cent off of every transaction, and the girlfriend's like, but you're stealing. It's like, well, it comes across more bumbling than that. It's not Hans Landa in Inglourious Bastards. Yeah. It's the guy with the stapler in Office Space who they're trying for, war crimes. Like, it just...
I think that's a good point. I think in the popular imagination, a lot of people have the image of the Nazi officer as someone like Hans Landa, this sort of extravagant, Satan-like figure of evil, the person who's like very intellectually evil, when in reality, a lot of Nazi officers were not anywhere near that. They were functionaries of a system that was committed to a ruthless agenda of murder. They were people who were totally uninteresting, except for the fact that they were complicit in something that was monstrous.
Yeah, and I think functionary there is almost the best description, where, Hans Landa is not an ideologue. He's doing kind of mercenary interest for himself. He changes sides when it fits him, but you kind of expect either it's someone who wants power and that's where power is, or it's someone who really believes in the ideology. But really, for Eichmann, he's a functionary. He's just a cog in this machine, and there's nothing beneath or above the little bureaucratic turns of phrase that he says. He is the bureaucratic turns of phrase that get handed down to him. There is not some overarching scheme or calculation for his own amassing of power, even though he's very interested in his own career. You don't get you get a sense of a frustrated middle manager, not like a Machiavelli. Like, to the extent that he cares about his own amassing of power, he's terrible at it.
There's a good book by Jonathan Littell called The Kindly Ones, which is a novel about Nazi officers. And to me, the thing that I think Littell does well in that book is he shows the way in which Nazi officers weren't radically committed to this ideology, but were rather using it as sort of a way to project their own individual obsessions. They were a bunch of people who, because this system allowed them to repurpose a great deal of society for their own ends, were capable of these acts of great evil. When these Nazi officers talk, they're not talking ideologically. They're often talking office politics. They're talking the basic, banal, mundane things of war. These people are not engaged intellectually or morally with the project they're undertaking. In fact, part of the uniquely interesting way that Nazism subverts the populace is that it gives them a way to fall asleep and be engaged in these horrendous acts without having to think about what they're truly doing. And only a small group of people at the front, who are sort of the grunts, actually have to deal with the radical reality of the terrible things that are being undertaken.
Yeah, and so I think it's kind of interesting here to kind of insert what Eichmann says for himself when he's being tried. So to every count that they indict him on, he doesn't say not guilty, he doesn't say innocent, he says not guilty in the sense of the indictment. So the actual quote here from Arendt is, "In what sense then did he think he was guilty? With the killing of Jews I had nothing to do. I never killed a Jew, or a non-Jew for that matter. I never killed any human being. I never gave an order to kill either a Jew or a non-Jew." Or, as he was later to qualify the statement, "It so happened that I had not once to do it. For he left no doubt that he would have killed his own father if he had received an order to that effect. Hence he repeated over and over that he could only be accused of aiding and abetting the annihilation of Jews, which he declared in Jerusalem to have been one of the greatest crimes in the history of humanity." And then later on she goes to say, Would he then have pleaded guilty if he had been indicted as an accessory to murder? Perhaps, but he would have made important qualifications. He'd not want to be one of those who now pretended that they had always been against it, whereas in fact they had been very eager to do what they were told to do. However, times change, and he, like Professor Mounds, had arrived at different insights. What he had done, and he did not want to deny it. Rather, he proposed to hang myself in public as a warning example for all anti-Semites on this earth. By this, he did not mean to say that he regretted anything, for repentance is for little children. So you kind of get a good sense there of the confused character of Eichmann that you get from reading Arendt's account of the trial. He admits that there were crimes and that he's suffering once and for all for these great war crimes, but at the same time, he denies any moral guilt. He kind of accepts the guilt of action, that he has done things that are going to be punished, but he doesn't take any moral responsibility for it. And I think that's kind of what you get out of it. Just so happens that I had not once to do it. He wasn't making choices. The order is what killed the people, and he is the function that is carrying out that order. And you kind of get a mixed sense that sometimes he really is that way. Sometimes he inserts his own opinions. Like, you get a very confused sense of his character from reading this, where he swears that he would never take an oath no matter what, and then 10 minutes later insists on adding an oath to his statement for emphasis, where he just is this almost comically at odds with himself character.
Yeah. He tries to articulate a version of himself which is cosmically passive, which is not a view that's totally alien in World War II. I mean, Oppenheimer's famous quote taken from the Bhagavad Gita, right? I have become death, the idea that Arjuna is becoming this passive instrument of Krishna who's killing everybody. There's that same idea that what you're doing is just the development of a historical, inexorable process, and that you as an agent are not responsible in any way for it. You're just simply the acting out of it. You're a sieve through which is being filtered the historical process, and you are morally disengaged from it. You might have your own private scruples about it, but they don't necessarily impinge upon what you do.
Yeah, so he's kind of refusing to take any personal moral responsibility for the things that happen through him. But that in some way only works because he's functioning in this very abstract bureaucratic system. He's doing logistics for railroads, for moving people, and there's all of these euphemisms. So I guess the question that you come back to over and over again as you're reading it is, how much is his stance of being this above the fray function of history only possible because he's part of a state that allows him to act at this abstract level? He doesn't have to look anyone in the eyes. He doesn't have to pull the trigger on anyone. And yet those people were killed by someone because he enabled it. It does make it difficult to draw simple cause and effect. The defense that he has is, yes, I'm guilty in a functional way. However, there's no cause and effect. I did not actually do anything. So do you think he's compartmentalizing his abstract actions versus the discrete actions that someone's taking? Or do you think he thinks those people are not morally guilty either, who actually pulled the trigger or, pulled the lever or whatever action actually hurt someone?
Eichmann's central delusion is that he is not who he is making himself to be through his actions. There's a divorce between his subjectivity and what he thinks about things and what he wants to try and do, and the actual consequences of his actions, which we can look upon and say is a wrong division, that he's not owning up to something. But to him, it's very easy to make that delusion precisely because of the abstract nature of his work. He's doing something that does not require the constant physical presence of experiencing his actions. Murdering somebody is a very physical thing. And when you can abstract that into something that happens on paper elsewhere, where you're just shuffling trains around, you're not actually killing anyone, you're just setting timetables for movements of quote unquote shipments, then you're dealing with something that is much easier on a day-to-day level to forget that you're involved with. Because then you're just moving around something that's happening elsewhere that other people are doing. In that sense of other people are causing this to happen, and I am just simply moving within that system as someone who may have my own subjective scruples about it, shatters when he actually has to go and see what's happening. There's a brief passage where Eichmann has to visit the gassing vans that are being used in Poland prior to the development of gassing chambers in the extermination camps. And he sees them and is horrified by it, as anybody would be. This idea that what you're doing is so brutal, so unthinkably monstrous, that when you have to deal with it physically, viscerally, there's a different element of experience entirely from when you're dealing with it as something that occurs on paperwork. This tactility of murder arises traumatically out of this abstract paperwork of genocide. And that was able to take even someone who presents themselves as a moral vacuum like Eichmann into having to take stock and recognize what he is actually involved with. And this is the only time when Eichmann undertakes something that could even reasonably be considered as subversion of his orders. He takes a group of Jews that are being sent to a death camp and he moves them into a place where they're not actively being killed. And this is his only real act of subversion, and it happens right after he has to deal with the physical nature of what he's doing. What's happening in this paperwork arises traumatically out of this ideological structure, which you have allowed to sort of comfort you as you facilitate this murder, and that shocks him with the reality of what he's doing for about like a month, right, before he goes back to being a dutiful servant of this genocide. And that gets at the heart of how you can perpetrate crimes of this scale involving all groups of society. Is you have to allow there to be some degree to which your complicity can be a blithe participation in something that's happening elsewhere, that is being done by others, that doesn't necessarily involve you, whose decisions are not necessarily being made by you. And this is most apparent in the development of a system of language rules within official correspondence and reportage about what the Nazis are doing to the Jews. Arendt writes, quote, "For whatever other reasons the language rules may have been devised, they proved of enormous help in the maintenance of order and sanity in the various widely diversified services whose cooperation was essential in this matter. Moreover, the very term language rule was itself a code name. It meant what in ordinary language would be called a lie. For when a bearer of secrets was sent to meet someone from the outside world, as when Eichmann was sent to show the Theresienstadt ghetto to International Red Cross representatives from Switzerland, he received, together with his orders, his language rule, which in this instance consisted of a lie about a non-existent typhus epidemic in the concentration camp of Bergen-Belsen, which the gentleman also wished to visit. The net effect of this language system was not to keep these people ignorant of what they were doing, but to prevent them from equating it with their old normal knowledge of murder and lies. Eichmann's great susceptibility to catchwords and stock phrases, combined with his incapacity for normal speech, made him, of course, an ideal subject for language rules. There's a degree to which Eichmann, because he's allowed to think of this in different terms, divorces his own knowledge of what he's doing from his experience of doing it, such that in a day-to-day routine, he's not actually feeling his involvement in an atrocity of this scale.
Just to give a little bit of background, one of the structural ways that the Nazis were helping people to not have to take personal responsibility for the things that they were doing was to turn around the burden of their moral transgressions as a weight that they're bearing. You can feel heroic for bearing this weight for the good of the country. It is not that you are lying to people, you are bearing this knowledge. It's not that you're deceiving people, you're bearing these secrets. And so there's a quote here where Arendt sort of describes the distinction, and she says, "Those who were told explicitly of the Führer's order were no longer, and that order is of the final solution, the plan to exterminate the Jews. They were no longer mere bearer of orders, but were advanced to bearer of secrets, and a special oath was administered to them." Yeah, and so just for some background, Arendt there's talking about language rules, and I think this is a really interesting concept that she talks about, where you would sort of expect there to be a straightforwardness in the way the Nazis are talking to themselves about what they're doing. You kind of have the idea that they're purely evil and that they almost can't tell that they should need to hide something. You know, there's this knowledge of good and evil thing where the fact that they know to hide it is sort of incriminating. Yeah. And so they have this elaborate system, these language rules, that help them to, in a systematic way, almost hide from themselves what it is that they're doing.
I mean, you think this is something that they're spending a lot of resources and manpower trying to do, so it should be something that they're proud of, right? That they're actively interested in, but actually they're trying to like hide it. They're ashamed of it because at some level they know the psychology of what they're doing.
Yeah, if someone were writing a movie script and the Nazis had this unclear of internal motivation, you would just imagine that would get sent back,
Yeah, exactly.
The Nazis should be clearly and purely evil in the popular imagination, right?
They should be delighting in the evil rather than trying to minimize its actual appearance.
Yeah, and it's like, oh, well, they think they're heroic. Oh, yeah, we had to do this to these people. It was the right thing to do. I don't feel guilty about that. I don't need to hide that. And yet you have, so here's a quote from Arendt talking about the language rules. And she says, "Furthermore, all correspondence referring to the matter was subject to rigid language rules. And except in the reports from the Einsatzgruppen, it's rare to find documents in which such bald words as extermination, liquidation, or killing occur. The prescribed code names for killing were final solution, evacuation, and special treatment. Deportation, unless it involved Jews directed to Theresienstadt, the old people's ghetto for privileged Jews, in which case it was called change of residence, received the names of resettlement and labor in the East. The point of these latter names being that Jews were indeed often temporarily resettled in ghettos, and that a certain percentage of them were temporarily used for labor." And so those are the rules. And then later on, talking about what the point of it is, Arendt says, "The member of the Nazi hierarchy most gifted at solving problems of conscience was Himmler. He coined slogans, like the famous watchword of the SS, taken from a Hitler speech before the SS in 1931, which is 'my honor is my loyalty,' catchphrases which Eichmann called winged words, and the judges empty talk, and issued them, as Eichmann recalled, around the turn of the year, presumably along with a Christmas bonus. Eichmann remembered only one of them and kept repeating it. These are battles which future generations will not have to fight again, alluding to the battles against women, children, old people, and other useless mouths." Other such phrases taken from speeches Himmler made to the commanders of the Einsatzgruppen and the higher SS and police leaders were, "To have stuck it out, and apart from exceptions caused by human weakness, to have remained decent. That is what has made us hard. This is a page of glory in our history, which has never been written and is never to be written." Or, "The order to solve the Jewish question. This was the most frightening order an organization could ever receive." Or, "We realize that what we are expecting from you is superhuman, to be superhumanly inhuman. All one can say is that their expectations were not disappointed. It's noteworthy, however, that Himmler hardly ever attempted to justify in ideological terms, and if he did, it was apparently quickly forgotten. What stuck in the minds of these men who become murderers was simply the notion of being involved in something historic, grandiose, unique, a great task that occurs once in 2,000 years, which must therefore be difficult to bear. This was important, because the murderers were not sadists or killers by nature. On the contrary, a systematic effort was made to weed out all those who derive physical pleasure from what they did." Close quote. So what's really shocking about that is you can see the dual function of what Eichmann would call winged words. These are at once helping to cloak what's actually happening from the public, but it's also helping people hide it from themselves. It's sort of giving them a way to mask what it is they're doing, and they have these slogans that help deflect the moral guilt. If it's difficult, then you're doing something heroic by bearing something difficult. The way that that's phrased, I think, changes the actual character of what people are feeling, which is one of the most shocking things about seeing this behind the scenes of Nazi ideology.
There's a degree to which this self-imposed concept of being tough and having to bear difficult moral questions is in effect a way of using conformity and this aestheticized sense of self and historical place to replace a moral sense, so that it's not that what you're doing is actually right, it's that what you're doing is actually wrong, but you're so heroic for taking that onto yourself and you're so important. And that's how you create this toughness in these officers, by imposing upon them the necessity of what they're doing, this inexorable nature of it.
You're a tragic hero, not a murderer.
This delusion evaporates when Nazis have to actually deal with these people, actually resist their ethnic cleansing machinations. And in a lot of places the Nazis went, there were varying levels of cooperation. But one of the few places where there's open resistance to this ethnic cleansing was in Denmark. Arendt writes, quote, "Politically and psychologically, the most interesting aspect of this incident is perhaps the role played by the German authorities in Denmark. Their obvious sabotage of orders from Berlin. It is the only case we know of in which the Nazis met with open native resistance, and the result seems to have been that those exposed to it changed their minds. They themselves apparently no longer looked upon the extermination of a whole people as a matter of course. They had met resistance based on principle, and their toughness had melted like butter in the sun. They had even been able to show a few timid beginnings of genuine courage. That the ideal of toughness, except perhaps for a few half-demented brutes, was nothing but a myth of self-deception, concealing a ruthless desire for conformity at any price, was clearly revealed at the Nuremberg trials, where the defendants accused and betrayed each other and assured the world that they had always been against it, or claimed, as Eichmann was to do, that their best qualities had been abused by their superiors. The atmosphere had changed, and although most of them must have known that they were doomed, not a single one of them had the guts to defend the Nazi ideology." End quote. This gets to the idea that a lot of what's happening with the Nazi immorality is a self-deception of the inexorable nature of what's happening, which allows for people to aestheticize themselves is making the tough choices, having to deal with the tough realities, and maybe even within their own delusion they consider themselves as making things better for the Jews because they're conscious people who care about how these things are being done, and it's better that I'm doing this in a nice, caring way rather than
humane is the word that they use.
Yeah, I'm doing this humanely because I'm enlightened rather than this person over here who would be brutish. And this allows them to trick themselves into conceiving of a moral sense of what they're doing within the radical, unimaginable immorality of it. It's all about self-deception, about inevitability, such that there never arises a moment in which one can make an authentic moral choice to resist the order, but rather moral choice is always delimited by the field of possibility ordained by Nazi elites.
Yeah, so actually talking about the self-deception there's a section that Arendt has trying to ask whether or not the Nazis and Eichmann are acting in bad faith, which I don't know if you thought this, but that seemed to me to be a little bit of like a existentialist Sartre call out using his little catchphrase there, So what she says is she's asking, quote, "Is this a textbook case of bad faith, of lying self-deception combined with outrageous stupidity, or is it simply the case of the eternally unrepentant criminal?" And then she later goes on to say that During the war, the lie most effective with the whole of the German people was the slogan of "the battle of destiny for the German people," coined by either Hitler or Goebbels, which made self-deception easier on three counts. It suggested first that the war was no war, second, that it was started by destiny and not by Germany, and third, that it was a matter of life and death for the Germans, who must annihilate their enemies or be annihilated. And she also says, but the practice of self-deception had become so common, almost a moral prerequisite for survival, that even now, 18 years after the collapse of the Nazi regime, when most of the specific content of its lies has been forgotten, it is sometimes difficult not to believe that mendacity has become an integral part of the German national character. End quote. So, yeah, kind of what you're saying there, they've been lying to themselves so much that it's become who they are. They don't remember the truth content of what they're saying. They just remember the message behind the slogans, the unity, the common cause and purpose. And I think you even see that in Eichmann, where all he remembers are his meetings with higher ups and the flow of power around him. He doesn't really remember any of the actual actions that he was a part of. And so kind of what we've been going over is the meaningless bureaucratic buzzwords or winged words that Eichmann keeps repeating are not just a coincidence. They're kind of integral to how something like this can even happen. You need to evacuate the meaning from what you're doing so that you can live with it. To the extent that you know what you're doing, you need to turn the moral responsibility from yourself to your own heroic self-sacrifice, to taking on the burdens of your country, even if that means doing something that's wrong. So one more quote, Arendt says, "Hence the problem was how to overcome not so much their conscience as the animal pity by which all normal men are affected in the presence of physical suffering. The trick used by Himmler, who apparently was rather strongly afflicted with these instinctive reactions himself, was very simple and probably very effective. It consisted in turning these instincts around, as it were, in directing them towards the self. So instead of saying, 'What horrible things I did to people,' the murderers would be able to say, 'What horrible things I had to watch in the pursuance of my duties, how heavily the task weighed upon my shoulders.'" So, yeah, all there is to say right there about the catchphrases and the just empty bureaucratic talk, but it is something that seems very important to Arendt, where we have Eichmann, this fumbling bureaucrat with no real thoughts of his own, just kind of spouting the company line over and over and over again. But that's not just an artifact of his own personality. She's trying to make the point that that's integral to how something like this can even happen. You have to evacuate the meaning from what you're doing. You have to be able to lionize yourself, to have stock phrases, reiterate to yourself why what you're doing is important, why you're sacrificing for a cause greater than yourself, why you need to not trust the pity you're feeling, the things you're seeing, because you're a small piece of something bigger and you should not be trying to figure out the morality of something bigger. You should trust in the group, in the government that has figured all of these things out for you.
There's a lie of universality that's happening there, where what you're doing is something that everybody is doing. And so any attempt you make to resist those actions is in some sense trying to swim against the entire tide of civilization. And what a lot of German people tried to say about their own actions within the Nazi system was that they felt like any resistance was meaningless. They were forced to go a, quote, inner emigration from the system, where what they were doing wasn't even involved in what was happening. They were helplessly floating along in the midst of this social hurricane which they could not control. And so there's a idea that any resistance would be practically useless, and so you can't blame me for not having acted in resistance because everybody was doing it, and so what was I supposed to do? And this lie breaks down when you get to one of the few examples of German people actually standing up and trying to make a difference. There's a story that's told of a German sergeant named Anton Schmidt who supported Jewish partisans in Poland. He accepted no money for this, and he was eventually discovered and killed for his actions in helping these partisans. Arendt writes, quote, "During the few minutes it took the witness to tell of the help that had come from a German sergeant, a hush settled over the courtroom. It was as though the crowd had spontaneously decided to observe the usual 2 minutes of silence in honor of the man named Anton Schmidt. And in those 2 minutes, which were like a sudden burst of light in the midst of impenetrable, unfathomable darkness, a single thought stood out clearly, irrefutably, beyond question. How utterly different everything would be today in this courtroom, in Israel, in Germany, in all of Europe, and perhaps in all countries of the world, if only more such stories could have been told." There are, of course, explanations of this devastating shortage, and they have been repeated many times. I shall give the gist of them in the words of one of the few subjectively sincere memoirs of the war published in Germany. Peter Baum, a German army physician who served at the Russian front, tells in Die unsichtbare Flagge of the killing of Jews in Sevastopol. They were collected by, quote, "the others," as he calls the SS mobile killing units, to distinguish them from ordinary soldiers, whose decency the book extols, and were put into a sealed-off part of the former GPU prison that abutted on the officers' lodgings where Baum's own unit was quartered. They were then made to board a mobile gas van, in which they died after a few minutes, whereupon the driver transported the corpses outside the city and unloaded them into tank ditches. This is a quote from Peter Baum. Quote, "We knew this. We did nothing. Anyone who had seriously protested or done anything against the killing unit would have been arrested within 24 hours and would have disappeared. It belongs among the refinements of totalitarian governments in our century that they don't permit their opponents to die a great, dramatic martyr's death for their convictions. A good many of us might have accepted such a death. The totalitarian state lets its opponents disappear in silent anonymity. It is certain that anyone who had dared to suffer death rather than silently tolerate the crime would have sacrificed his life in vain. That is not to say that such a sacrifice would have been morally meaningless. It would have only been practically useless. None of us had a conviction so deeply rooted that we could have taken upon ourselves a practically useless sacrifice for the sake of a higher moral meaning." That's the end of the Baum quote, back into the Arendt quote. Needless to add, the writer remains unaware of the emptiness of this much emphasized decency in the absence of what he calls a higher moral meaning. But the hollowness of respectability, for decency under such circumstances no more than respectability, was not what became apparent in the example afforded by Sergeant Anton Schmidt. Rather, it was the fatal flaw in the argument itself, which at first sounds so hopelessly plausible. It is true that totalitarian domination tried to establish these holes of oblivion into which all deeds, good and evil, would disappear. But just as the Nazis' feverish attempts from June 1942 on to erase all traces of the massacres through cremation, through burning in open pits, through the uses of explosives and flamethrowers and bone-crushing machinery were doomed to failure, so all efforts to let their opponents disappear in silent anonymity were in vain. The holes of oblivion do not exist. Nothing human is that perfect. And there are simply too many people in the world to make oblivion possible. One man will always be left alive to tell the story. Hence, nothing can ever be practically useless, at least not in the long run. It would be of great practical usefulness for Germany today, not merely for her prestige abroad, but for her sadly confused inner condition, if there were more such stories to be told. For the lesson of such stories is simple and within everybody's grasp. Politically speaking, it is that under conditions of terror, most people will comply, but some people will not. Just as the lesson of the countries to which the final solution was proposed is that it could happen in most places, but it did not happen everywhere. Humanly speaking, no more is required, and no more can reasonably be asked for this planet to remain a place fit for human habitation. End quote. A lot of these Germans were looking for this aestheticized great moral moment in which they might have then hypothetically acted. If only I could die a great dramatic martyr's death, I would undertake this moral action. If only there was some sort of tangible outcome that I could affect through my actions, I could die satisfied knowing that I would be a hero. But if I can't be a hero, then it's practically useless. You disappear, you become anonymous, and nobody wants to die for morality if they end up being anonymous. The reward of morality is not having been a good person, but to be perceived as being a good person. And if you disappear into these, quote, holes of oblivion, then you're not being seen being a good person, and therefore your actions are pointless. They don't actually affect anything. Whereas what Arendt argues against this is that there's a higher value to morality than to affect an outcome necessarily. There's an enduring development of the human story that needs these moments of humanity within these overwhelmingly oppressive moments of inhumanity to derive any continuous sense of historical self. If we don't have examples in the past of people standing up, even if it's to fail, against these dire moral straits, then we're all condemned as people who are capable of such violence. Humanity has to bear the moral weight of everybody who stood by silently and did not do anything. This gets to the famous Martin Niemöller quote, where he's talking about, first they came for the socialists and I did not speak out because I was not socialist. Then they came for the trade unions and I did not speak out. It's that idea that when you're not...
when there's nothing like at stake for you.
Yeah, when you don't have to put your own self into morality, then the only value of morality is the extent to which you're affecting some sort of grand outcome that can aestheticize you as a hero who fought back. The idea of morality as something that is imperative even when it's undertaken in failure is what Arendt is trying to argue here against this idea of, oh, well, because it would be meaningless, I wouldn't do anything. There is something valuable in being the person who says no. She's talking about how the Holocaust could have happened everywhere, but it did not happen everywhere. There are some places where it did not happen. And that is an important, vital quality of the human experience that makes living justified and morally worthwhile. Because there is an extent to which your exception, even if it doesn't manage to overcome the system against which it is being accepted, nevertheless produces something valuable which cannot be quelled. It's about the question of passivity once more. Are you somebody who's just simply watching passively, and if you don't have the agency to stop it, then you're just lost in passivity? Or is there a value in resisting something? Is there an activity there? And that's what Arendt is trying to argue, that even when it seems like you're hopelessly passively watching something, being the person who stands up and does something about it makes you morally justified in a way that the people who sat there and watched can never be morally justified.
Yeah, you're describing her opinion that this could have happened anywhere, but it didn't. I feel more hopeless that something like this could happen again after having read this. I don't know how you feel, but it definitely seems like you don't even need very many people to believe it to have something like this happen. I think someone like Eichmann could have been doing logistics for any purpose and have been equally happy doing it if someone above him were inspiring, Yeah. So I don't know. I guess.
I mean, there's this sort of lie of history where we sort of accumulate and move and progress. And in reality, the things that we do are humanly capable. Nazism happened once and it can happen again because these things are not historical accidents, but they are central parts of the social system. There is a way in which evil can perpetuate itself across scales, and that is not something that only happened in Germany and could never happen again, but is a fundamental facet of how we're all in some way willing to be complicit with the evils of our social structures. What Arendt is dealing with here is a fundamentally, existentially terrifying moment of our ability to perpetuate acts of great injustice and inhumanity. And how can we deal with ourselves as people capable of that? It's difficult, but part of how we deal with it is by recognizing that there is value in morality even when it doesn't affect change, that being the person who did not participate is a meaningful choice. And it's not practically useless, but in fact practically of great use to have been the person who resisted, even if that resistance is doomed to failure.
And do you think that it's an individual responsibility there? So when Arendt's describing Ben-Gurion, the Israeli leader during this trial for Eichmann, Ben-Gurion is contrasting Israeli heroism and Jewish submissive weakness to say that as individual people, the Jews were marched off and taken advantage of, but together as a nation state, they can fight back. Like, that is his suggestion on how to improve that. But it seems like you're kind of saying the opposite. It's individual acts of morality, not a counter state that is the counterforce to something like this happening again. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, Arendt's argument here is that it's about Anton Schmidt, like this one guy. And if more such stories could be told, if there were more people who were like this one person, then they would accumulate into something that could provide a meaningful moral resistance that could prevent such a thing. And so there is sort of an individual element to it.
Yeah, like she does also give the example where it takes one king agreeing to wear the star that identifies Jews to render the whole symbol meaningless. You know, it only takes, in that case, a powerful person, but in an individual act to sort of save an entire country's Jewry from the Holocaust.
Yeah.
So, yeah, last thing maybe to talk about is, what are we supposed to think of Eichmann after all of this? Is he more guilty, less guilty than you thought? Does his incompetence in any way ameliorate the things that he was doing? You know, we kind of get Arendt's view here. And the very end in the epilogue, she says, quote, "Let us assume for the sake of argument that it was nothing more than misfortune that made you a willing instrument in the organization of mass murder. There still remains the fact that you have carried out, and therefore actively supported, a policy of mass murder. For politics is not like the nursery. In politics, obedience and support are the same. And just as you supported and carried out a policy of not wanting to share the earth with the Jewish people and the people of a number of other nations, as though you and your superiors had any right to determine who should and who should not inhabit the world, we find that no one, that is, no member of the human race, can be expected to want to share this earth with you. That is the reason, and the only reason, you must hang." So, I don't know. I mean, personally, that seems very strong to say the only reason. It's only that lack of empathy there, putting himself in this place to judge the worthiness of others to live, that is holding him accountable. That's holding him accountable for the moral failing, but not necessarily the actions. I guess I don't know that I agree or disagree with that, but that strikes me as a very strong formulation there to say the only failing is this complete failure of empathy divorced from the factual proceedings that the trial was actually spent most of its time arguing about.
Yeah, I mean, part of what interests Arendt and Eichmann, I think, is the extent to which he tries to absolve himself, like Pontius Pilate, of his crimes by participating in the social structure entirely, such that he can't be divorced from it. And so the question of how to judge Eichmann becomes the question of how can you extricate somebody from that social system such that they stand trial as autonomous moral agent. Trying to figure out how he's guilty involves finding out the right way to destroy Eichmann's view of himself as somebody who is simply obeying the law, and therefore his crimes occur through something else of which he is only a functionary.
Okay, so I think we're supposed to judge Eichmann not just in light of the bumbling trial performance that he gives or the things he did during the war. You're supposed to see him almost as this comic figure struggling to find meaning for himself, but without the ability to create it. You know, he's always falling back on these empty catchphrases and cliches, and the only clear memories he even has of the war are of the meetings where he got to talk with someone who was several ranks more important than he was. Like, I think kind of, if we're supposed to get a warning out of this, we're supposed to be horrified by what he became so that he could be doing things. And this is really reiterated with the scene we're talking about, his hanging. So Arendt writes, quote, Adolf Eichmann went to the gallows with great dignity. He had asked for a bottle of red wine and had drunk half of it. He refused the help of the Protestant minister, the Reverend William Hull, who offered to read the Bible with him. He had only 2 more hours to live, and therefore no time to waste. He walked the 50 yards from his cell to the execution chamber, calm and erect, with his hands bound behind him. When the guards tied his ankles and knees, he asked them to loosen the bonds so that he could stand straight. I don't need that, he said, when the black hood was offered him. He was in complete command of himself. Nay, he was more. He was completely himself. Nothing could have demonstrated this more convincingly than the grotesque silliness of his last words. He began by stating emphatically that he was a Gottgläubiger, to express in common Nazi fashion that he was no Christian and did not believe in life after death. He then proceeded, After a short while, gentlemen, we shall all meet again. Such is the fate of all men. Long live Germany, long live Argentina, long live Austria, I shall not forget them. In the face of death, he had found the cliché used in funeral oratory. Under the gallows, his memory played him the last trick. He was elated, and he forgot that this was his own funeral. It was as though in those last moments he was summing up the lesson that this long course in human wickedness had taught us. The lesson of the fearsome, word and thought-defying banality of evil. End quote. It kind of takes us back to where we started. When you hear people talk about banality of evil, it's sort of to say evil is just walking amongst you in plain clothes. But I think it's really that evil hollowed Eichmann out, or he was only able to be evil because he lacked this imagination and this empathy, or maybe some combination thereof. That what you really should be afraid of is the inability to think for yourself, to empathize and understand other people, and that as long as people like that exist, they can be harnessed for great evil. It could have happened anywhere. And so it's not animus. It wasn't really hate that drove Eichmann. It was just this, he had so completely internalized the lionization that had been created by these party phrases that it became who he was. All that he had left was this sense of heroic sacrifice, but it doesn't matter for what. And so I think in the end, that's kind of the biggest takeaway of the banality of evil, is that if you give up your moral agency, you can have high-minded ideals and noble sacrifices, and that won't absolve you of the moral weight of actually making the decisions. You cannot abdicate yourself from moral decision-making through any amount of abstraction or deflection.
What's terrifying about Eichmann is not necessarily who he was, because he's clearly a very insignificant person, but how social structures were able to take somebody like Eichmann and harness him to perform such a monstrous act of evil at such immense scale. The reason why Eichmann proves to be sort of a disappointing defendant in this trial is because he fails to live up to the society that he is meant to represent. Because the terror of Eichmann is not that he's this force of active evil, but rather that human capacity for passiveness, even in the most radically moral moments of imperative action. And this gets to, I think, one of the essential ideas of Eichmann's evil is how he justifies himself through that passivity. He quotes Kant in a very strange way, and Arendt argues against his use of Kant by writing, "What he failed to point out in court was that in this period of crimes legalized by the state, as he himself now called it, he had not simply dismissed the Kantian formula as no longer applicable. He had instead distorted it to read, act as if the principle of your actions were the same as that of the legislator or of the law of the land." Or in Hans Frank's formulation of the categorical imperative in the Third Reich, which Eichmann might have known, act in such a way that the Führer, if he knew of your action, would approve of it. Kant, to be sure, had never intended to say anything of the sort. On the contrary, to him, every man was a legislator the moment he started to act. By using his practical reason, man found the principles that could and should be the principles of law. But it is true that Eichmann's unconscious distortion agrees with what he himself called the version of Kant for the household use of the little man. In this household use, all that is left of Kant's spirit is the demand that a man do more than obey the law, that he go beyond the mere call of obedience and identify his own will with the principle behind the law, the source from which the law sprang. In Kant's philosophy, that source was practical reason. In Eichmann's household use of him, it was the will of the Führer, end quote. The essential evil of Eichmann is that he takes law-abiding to such an extreme extent that he doesn't just obey the law, but he instead chooses to will that law into action. He has aligned himself so thoroughly with his orders that he becomes in himself the enactor of that order. And how the totalitarian structure estranges yourself from who you become is the idea that you become neutralized in this way. But that neutralization doesn't render you passive. It instead renders you very active. That what we find evil in Eichmann is not that he was some sort of passive actor shuffling trains around, but that he allowed himself to become so thoroughly an instrument of this historic crime that there's nothing left of Eichmann but that historic crime. Hence his ridiculous words at the gallows. He ends up having nothing to say of himself but the structures that spoke through him. He has hollowed himself out and become a mere tool for horrendous ends. And the horror of his existence is the fact that social structures can do that to people, that it can hollow them out so thoroughly that there's nothing left of them but the enactment of the state.
Okay, yeah. So, I don't know. I thought that was really interesting. It sort of is very against trope of a maniacal mustache twirling Nazi. It was funny. It's kind of horrifying. And I guess that's kind of what I took away.
Yes. Well, thank you for listening to the inaugural episode of our show. We will be back eventually, hopefully sometime, with another episode about something or other, assuredly. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.
Goodbye.